Chaplain Morrison held the dog tags in his shaking hand. February 9th, 1945, somewhere in the Ardennes, a German lieutenant lay dying in the aid station, asking for last rites in perfect English. Morrison had buried 7 Americans that morning, boys from Iowa and Tennessee who'd never see home. Could he offer God's comfort to the man whose army had killed them? The lieutenant had maybe 20 minutes left. His wounds were beyond saving. Morrison's own faith said every soul deserved mercy, but his grief said otherwise. The dying man's eyes found his. The other medics watched in silence. Morrison had his prayer book and his conviction, but nothing had prepared him for this. War didn't sort the righteous from the damned. It just took them all. He opened the book, unsure which words would come. The aid station was a commandeered barn. Wood walls, dirt floor, holes in the roof where shells had punched through, cold air poured in through every gap. The medics had done their best to make it functional, set up cots, hung blankets as dividers, created spaces for surgery and triage and dying. Most men who came here died. The serious cases, the ones the field medics couldn't handle, chest wounds, abdominal trauma, head injuries, they arrived on stretchers or carried by friends. Some conscious, some not, some screaming, some silent, all desperate for help that often couldn't save them. Chaplain William Morrison moved through the barn offering what help he could, not medical help. He had no training for that. Spiritual help, comfort, prayer, the presence of someone who believed there was meaning beyond the blood and pain and death. He'd been a chaplain for 18 months, joined the army in 1943, straight from seminary in Chicago, Presbyterian minister, 28 years old, young for a chaplain. But the army needed ministers, and Morrison felt called, felt that God wanted him here, serving soldiers, offering faith in places where faith seemed impossible. Morrison had grown up in Illinois, small town, farm country. His father was a minister too, rural church, congregation of 50 on a good Sunday. Morrison had watched his father serve that community for 30 years, baptisms, weddings, funerals, hospital visits, crisis counseling, the daily work of ministry in a place where everyone knew everyone. His father had been gentle, patient, never raised his voice, never judged harshly, never turned anyone away. Morrison had learned from watching him, learned that ministry was about presence more than preaching, about listening more than talking, about showing up when needed and staying quiet when words would only hurt. He'd gone to seminary in 1940, McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago, Presbyterian, good school, strong faculty. Morrison excelled, top of his class. Everyone said he'd be a great minister someday, gifted preacher, natural theologian, deep faith paired with sharp intellect, the kind of combination that produced great leaders. Seminary taught him theology, church history, biblical languages, homiletics, pastoral care, all the skills he'd need for ministry. But it was theoretical, academic, books and lectures and debates about doctrine, important work, foundational work. But divorced from reality, from the mess of actual human suffering. Morrison graduated in 1943. War was raging, Europe was burning. Young men were dying. The army needed chaplains desperately, needed ministers willing to go into combat, to face death daily, to offer spiritual care in circumstances that defied everything seminary had prepared them for. Morrison volunteered immediately, felt it was his duty, his calling. God wanted him in the war, serving soldiers, offering hope in hell. He believed that, trusted it, let it carry him through training and deployment and the first terrible months of combat. Chaplain school was at Fort Benning, 8 weeks, learning military procedures, rank structure, how to wear a uniform, how to salute, how to function in an army that ran on discipline and hierarchy and orders. It felt strange after 4 years of seminary, academic freedom, theological debate, exploration of doubt and questions. The army didn't want questions, wanted obedience, wanted chaplains who could function in the chain of command, who could support military objectives while maintaining religious integrity. Morrison struggled with that tension, still struggled with it. The balance between serving God and serving Caesar, between prophetic witness and institutional loyalty. They shipped him to England in September 1943, part of the build-up for D-Day, attached to the 28th Infantry Division, Pennsylvania National Guard unit. Good soldiers, experienced. They'd been training for the invasion for months, running drills, practicing amphibious landings, preparing for the biggest military operation in history. Morrison met his unit in October, introduced himself, tried to fit in. The soldiers were skeptical at first. Another chaplain, another minister telling them God cared while they prepared to die on French beaches. They'd heard it before, didn't believe it, couldn't afford to believe it. Morrison didn't preach to them, didn't try to convince them, just showed up. Attended briefings, participated in training, made himself available, offered what he could without pushing. Some men came to him, asked questions, sought counsel. Most didn't. That was okay. Ministry was about availability, not conversion, about being there when needed, not forcing your presence where it wasn't wanted. D-Day came on June 6, 1944. Morrison's division landed on Omaha Beach, not first wave, third. By the time they arrived, the beach was chaos, bodies everywhere, wounded men crying for medics, destroyed equipment, the smell of death and cordite and fear. Morrison had never seen anything like it. Nothing in seminary prepared him for this, for the scale of suffering, for the randomness of death, for the way men died begging for mothers who couldn't help them. He'd waded ashore in water turned red with blood, stumbled over bodies, ducked machine gun fire that kicked up spray around him, made it to the seawall, crouched there, stunned, overwhelmed, questioning everything he'd believed about God and purpose and his calling to this place. A sergeant grabbed him, yelled over the gunfire, pointed to wounded men. Morrison moved, started doing his job, offered prayers, held hands, closed eyes, committed souls, one after another. Dozens, hundreds maybe. The day was a blur of blood and prayers and death. Morrison moved through it mechanically, doing what he'd been trained to do, functioning when thought would have paralyzed him. That first day changed him, broke something in his understanding of faith. He'd believed God protected the righteous, answered prayers, intervened in history. But on Omaha Beach, good men died randomly, prayers seemed to vanish into smoke. God seemed absent, or present but indifferent, or present but powerless against bullets and shells and the machinery of war. Morrison struggled with that for weeks, months, wrestled with questions that had no answers. Why did God allow this? Why did good men die while evil men lived? Why did prayers go unanswered? Why did Morrison feel so alone in his ministry? Where was God in all this suffering? He never found satisfying answers. Just kept praying, kept showing up, kept doing his job. Faith became less about certainty and more about persistence, less about understanding and more about presence, less about answers and more about being willing to sit with questions. The division pushed inland after Normandy, through the hedgerows, through France, through Belgium. Morrison moved with them, performing funerals, counseling soldiers, leading worship services when time allowed, mostly just being available, being present, offering what comfort could be offered when comfort seemed inadequate against the scale of suffering. He buried his first soldier on June 8th, Private James Wilson, Ohio. 20 years old, machine gun burst to the chest, died instantly. Morrison had barely known him, had spoken to him once, but he said prayers over Wilson's grave anyway, committed him to God's care, wrote a letter to Wilson's family, said he died quickly without pain, lied to offer comfort he couldn't give himself. More followed. Dozens, hundreds. Morrison lost count after a while, the faces blurred together. the names forgotten. Just an endless succession of young men dying far from home, each one requiring prayers, each one deserving better than a shallow grave in foreign soil, each one breaking Morrison's heart a little more. The Ardennes campaign had tested that faith, tested it daily, hourly, with every wounded soldier, every dying boy, every prayer that seemed to go unanswered. Morrison kept praying anyway, kept believing anyway, because what else was there? If God wasn't here, wasn't listening, wasn't caring, then the whole enterprise was meaningless. Just violence and death and suffering with no purpose, no redemption, no hope. Morrison couldn't accept that, wouldn't accept it. So he prayed for the wounded, for the dying, for the medics who tried to save them. For himself when the weight became too much, he prayed and trusted that God heard even when evidence suggested otherwise. This morning had been particularly hard. A German artillery barrage at dawn caught an American patrol in the open. 7 men killed instantly. 3 more wounded. The wounded were brought to the aid station. 1 died during surgery. The other 2 were stable, might survive, might not. Time would tell. The barrage had come without warning. Just after 0600. First light, the patrol had been returning from a night reconnaissance mission, tired, exposed, wrong place at the wrong time. The German gunners had been perfect. 3 shells, direct hits. The patrol was obliterated. 7 dead, 3 wounded, 2 more would die from wounds over the next week. War's mathematics. Cold, final, indifferent. Morrison had heard the explosions, felt them through the ground, knew immediately what it meant. Casualties incoming, death to process. Prayers to say he'd prepared himself. Had done this dozens of times, knew the drill, but knowing didn't make it easier, just made it familiar. Routine, the normalization of horror that let you function when function was all you could manage. The bodies arrived on stretchers, covered with blankets, blood soaked through. Morrison helped carry them, laid them in the designated area, away from the living, away from the wounded who might survive. Death had its own geography, its own protocols, its own terrible efficiency. He'd uncovered the first body, Private Thomas Wilson, Iowa. 19 years old, farm kid, talked about corn and cattle and his girlfriend back home. Showed Morrison her picture once. Pretty girl, bright smile. They'd planned to marry after the war, have kids, run the family farm together, build a life. None of that would happen now. Wilson's face was peaceful despite the violence that killed him. Shell fragment to the chest. Death was instant. No pain, no awareness, just there one moment, gone the next. That was merciful if anything in war could be called merciful. Morrison said a prayer. Brief, just acknowledgement that Wilson had lived, had mattered, had deserved better than dying in Belgian mud before he'd barely started living. The prayer felt inadequate. They always did. But Morrison said them anyway, because someone had to, because silence seemed worse than inadequate words. The second body was Corporal James Martinez, Tennessee, 22, married, new father, baby born 3 months before he deployed. He'd shown Morrison pictures, tiny thing, all pink and wrinkled. Martinez had cried looking at those photos, missing his daughter, wondering if he'd ever see her again. Now he wouldn't. The baby would grow up without him, would know her father only through photographs and stories, through the medal they'd send home, through the flag that would cover his casket when they finally shipped him back, through everything except actual memory, actual presence, actual father. Morrison prayed again, asked God to comfort Martinez's wife, to help her raise their daughter, to somehow make meaning from this senseless death. Even as he prayed, Morrison doubted any of it mattered, doubted God was listening, doubted prayer changed anything. But he prayed anyway, because doubt didn't excuse duty, just made it harder. 5 more bodies, 5 more prayers. Private Michael O'Brien, Massachusetts; Private David Kowalski, Pennsylvania; Private John Anderson, Minnesota; Corporal Robert Thompson, Virginia; Private William Jackson, Georgia. All young, all dead, all with families who'd receive telegrams, with mothers who'd cry, with fathers who'd try to stay strong, with girlfriends or wives or children who'd have to learn to live with permanent loss. Morrison said prayers over each one, tried to remember something personal about each, some detail that acknowledged their individuality, their humanity, their uniqueness. But the memories blurred. Too many dead, too many prayers, too many graves. The faces merged, the names forgotten, just an endless succession of young men dying and Morrison inadequately trying to give their deaths meaning. He'd buried them that afternoon. 7 graves, shallow. The ground was frozen, took hours to dig, other soldiers helped. Nobody complained, just worked, because the dead deserved proper burial, even here, even in wartime, even when everything else was chaos. Morrison used proper liturgy. Read from his book, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies." The words felt hollow, empty. These men had believed, had trusted God, had prayed, and they died anyway, randomly, senselessly, without purpose or meaning or justice. But Morrison read the words anyway, because they were all he had, because tradition mattered even when tradition seemed inadequate, because these soldiers deserved the dignity of proper burial, of prayers said over them, of acknowledgement that they'd lived and mattered and would be mourned. Each grave got a cross, made from ammunition crate wood, crude but functional. Dog tags nailed to the crossbar, name, serial number, blood type, religion, everything reduced to data, to identification, to military efficiency. But at least it was something. At least their graves would be marked. At least someone would know they were here. Morrison had returned to the aid station exhausted, physically and spiritually. 7 crosses, 7 graves, 7 families who'd receive telegrams, 7 mothers who would cry. 63 total since he'd landed on Omaha Beach. 63 American soldiers he'd buried. 63 lives ended. 63 futures erased. The weight was crushing. He'd sat alone for a while, trying to process, trying to pray for himself, for strength, for faith, for the ability to keep doing this when it felt pointless, when God seemed absent, when every prayer felt like shouting into void, but the prayers wouldn't come, just sat there, empty, hollow, questioning everything he'd believed about God and purpose, and why good men died while evil men lived. That's when they brought Carl in, the German lieutenant, wounded, dying, needing prayer. Morrison's first response was anger, fury. 7 Americans in fresh graves. And now he was supposed to care about a German, supposed to offer comfort to the enemy, supposed to pray for someone whose army had killed Wilson and Martinez and all the others. Everything in him wanted to refuse, wanted to walk away, wanted to let the German die alone, and afraid because that felt like justice, like what he deserved, like appropriate consequence for choosing the wrong side, for fighting for evil, for killing Americans, for being part of the machine that created all this suffering. But something stopped him, made him pause, made him look at the dying man instead of just the uniform, see the humanity instead of just the enemy, recognize fear and pain, and the universal human need for comfort in the face of death. It wasn't mercy Morrison felt, just recognition. This man was someone's son, someone's husband maybe, someone's brother, someone who'd existed as a person before war turned him into an enemy. That's what made Morrison stop beside Carl's cot. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not even compassion really, just acknowledgement that dying alone was terrible regardless of which uniform you wore, that everyone deserved someone to sit with them at the end. That mercy wasn't about deserving, was about being human, about recognizing humanity even in enemies, especially in enemies. So Morrison had stayed, asked questions, listened to answers, learned about Karl's life, his teaching, his family, his regrets, his faith, his fear, all the things that made him human instead of just enemy, all the complexity that war tried to erase but couldn't fully destroy. And when the moment came, when Karl asked for prayer, Morrison had chosen mercy, had opened his book, had read the ancient words, had offered grace when everything said he shouldn't, because that's what faith demanded, what God required, what Christian mercy looked like when stripped of all the comfortable rationalizations about who deserved it and who didn't. 7 Americans buried that morning. 1 German prayed for that afternoon. The mathematics should have been simple, should have been obvious. Americans mattered more, got priority, got prayers. Germans didn't, got nothing, got what they deserved. But Morrison couldn't do that math, couldn't accept that equation, couldn't believe God's love was that selective, that small, that tribal. So he'd prayed for Karl, for himself, for the broken world that made such choices necessary, for the grace to believe that mercy mattered even here, even now, even when everything screamed otherwise. Morrison had returned to the aid station exhausted, physically and spiritually. He'd performed burial services for 63 American soldiers in the past month, 63 prayers, 63 families who would receive telegrams, 63 mothers who would cry. The weight of it was crushing sometimes, made him question everything. His faith, his calling, his ability to continue. But he continued anyway, because the living still needed him, still needed prayer, still needed someone to tell them God cared, even if Morrison himself sometimes doubted it. The German officer had arrived an hour ago, brought in by American soldiers who'd found him in a foxhole, shot multiple times. Chest and abdomen, bleeding internally. The medics triaged him, determined his wounds were fatal. Nothing they could do, just morphine for pain, just time for dying. They'd placed him on a cot in the corner, away from the American wounded. Standard procedure. Enemy casualties got treatment, but not priority, not proximity. They died separately, alone mostly, watched by guards but not comforted, not prayed over, not mourned. Morrison had noticed him during his rounds, noticed the German uniform, the rank insignia, lieutenant, young, maybe 30, conscious, in pain, watching Morrison move through the barn, following him with eyes that held something. Morrison recognized fear, the fear of dying alone, far from home, without comfort, without God. Morrison had walked past. His duty was to American soldiers, to his own men, not to the enemy, not to the people who'd killed 7 boys that morning. The German could die alone. That was war. That was justice. That was what happened when you chose the wrong side. But something made Morrison stop. Turn back. Look at the dying man again. See not a German soldier, but a human being, someone's son, someone's brother, someone who would die in the next hour and pass into eternity, afraid and alone, unless Morrison did something. The medics watched him approach the German's cot, said nothing. This was Morrison's domain, his decision. They wouldn't interfere either way. Morrison stood beside the cot, looked down at the wounded officer. The man's eyes found his. Recognition passed between them. The German knew what Morrison was, could see the chaplain's insignia, the cross on his collar, the prayer book in his hand, knew what Morrison could offer, what Morrison represented. Chaplain, the German said. His English was perfect, accent barely noticeable. I am dying. Morrison nodded. Yes, I would like last rites, if you are willing. Morrison hesitated. Last rites, the final sacrament, the commendation of a soul to God's mercy. Morrison had performed it dozens of times, always for American soldiers, never for the enemy, never for someone whose army had killed his own. You're Catholic? Morrison asked. Catholics had last rites. Protestants had similar rituals but different traditions. Lutheran, the German said. But I understand Catholic rites. I understand prayer, any words. He coughed. Blood flecked his lips. I do not want to die alone, without God. Morrison looked at his prayer book. Presbyterian liturgy. Not Lutheran, not Catholic, but close enough. Prayer was prayer, God was God. The words might differ, but the meaning remained the same. Commendation of a soul, petition for mercy, recognition that death was not the end. But this was different. This wasn't an American soldier. This was the enemy. Someone who'd fought against everything Morrison believed in. Someone whose army had started this war, had invaded countries, had killed civilians, had done terrible things. Could Morrison offer comfort to that? Could he pray for someone who represented so much evil? His faith said yes. Every soul deserved mercy. That was the core teaching. That was what Jesus preached. Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. Offer grace even to the undeserving, especially to the undeserving. But his grief said no. 7 graves that afternoon. 7 boys who'd never go home. 7 families destroyed. How could he comfort their killer? How could he offer God's mercy to the man whose army had made those graves necessary? Morrison stood frozen, torn between duty to God and duty to the dead, between theological conviction and human anger, between what he knew was right and what he felt was just. The German watched him struggle, saw the conflict in Morrison's face, understood it probably, must have known what his uniform represented, what anger it provoked, what judgment it deserved. I understand if you cannot, the German said quietly. I have done nothing to earn your compassion. My army has caused great suffering. I am part of that. I do not expect forgiveness. Just another cough. More blood. Just do not let me die alone, please. Morrison looked at the other medics. They watched silently, waiting to see what he would do. No judgment in their faces, just curiosity, just waiting. This was Morrison's decision alone. He thought about his training. Seminary had covered this, ministering to all people, not just the righteous, not just the easy cases, everyone who needed God, everyone who asked. The good thief on the cross beside Jesus had been a criminal, had done terrible things. Jesus had offered him paradise anyway. That was the model. That was the example Morrison was supposed to follow. But seminary didn't prepare you for this. Didn't prepare you for the weight of real moral choices. Didn't prepare you for grief and anger and 7 fresh graves. Theory was easy. Practice was impossible. Morrison made his decision, pulled a wooden stool beside the cot, sat down, opened his prayer book, found the page for commendation of the dying, the words he'd spoken so many times, the words that committed souls to God's keeping. What's your name? Morrison asked. Karl, the German said. Karl Hoffman, Lieutenant, Wehrmacht. I'm Chaplain William Morrison, U.S. Army. Thank you for this, Chaplain Morrison. You do not know what it means. Morrison nodded. Didn't trust himself to speak yet. Just looked at the prayer book. Read the familiar words silently, prepared himself to say them aloud, to offer this dying enemy what he'd offered so many dying Americans. Grace, mercy, hope. Tell me about yourself, Karl, Morrison said. Stalling maybe, trying to see the human instead of the uniform. Where are you from? Munich, Karl said. His breathing was labored. Each word took effort. I was a teacher. Mathematics. Gymnasium. High school, you would call it. A teacher, Morrison repeated. Tried to reconcile that with the uniform, with the enemy. Teachers taught children, helped them learn, built futures. This man had done that before the war turned him into something else. Yes, I loved it. Loved teaching. Loved watching students understand. That moment when equations made sense. When numbers became beautiful. I wanted to return to that. After the war. Why did you join? Morrison asked. Maybe shouldn't have. Maybe not appropriate. But he needed to understand. needed to know who he was praying for. Carl's eyes closed briefly. Pain or memory? Hard to say. I was drafted. 1940. Had no choice. I did not want to fight. Did not support. He trailed off. Couldn't finish. Or wouldn't. Morrison waited. Let the silence stretch. Sometimes silence said more than words. I do not expect you to understand, Carl continued. I do not expect you to forgive. I wore the uniform. I followed orders. I fought in this war. That makes me guilty. I know this. God knows this. I will answer for it. What will you tell him? Morrison asked. God. I mean, when you meet him. Carl thought about that, struggling with pain and mortality, and the question Morrison had posed. The truth, he said finally, that I was weak, that I followed when I should have refused, that I valued my life more than righteousness, that I am sorry, deeply sorry, for all of it. Morrison nodded. It wasn't absolution, wasn't redemption, but it was honest. That counted for something. Maybe. Do you have family? Morrison asked. Wife, Anna, 2 children. Franz is 6. Greta is 3, in Munich still. If they survived the bombing, I do not know. Letters stopped reaching me months ago. Morrison thought about that. This man might die not knowing if his family was alive, might pass into eternity carrying that uncertainty, that grief. That was its own kind of hell. I'm sorry, Morrison said. Meant it. Despite everything. Despite the uniform and the war and the 7 graves. In that moment, he was just sorry. For Carl, for Anna, for Franz and Greta, for all the suffering war created. We all are, Carl said. All of us who fight, all of us who kill, all of us who die. We are all sorry. It changes nothing. But we are sorry. Morrison believed him, could hear the sincerity, could see the regret in Carl's eyes. This wasn't a monster, wasn't evil incarnate, just a man who'd made choices, some forced, some willing, all with consequences. A man who would die in minutes and face whatever judgment came next. Are you ready? Morrison asked. Meaning the prayer, the commendation, the final rite. Carl nodded. I am ready. Thank you, Chaplain. Morrison took a breath, steadied himself. This was his duty, his calling, regardless of uniform or nationality, or the anger that still simmered beneath his compassion. He was here to minister, to offer God's grace to those who needed it, to be Christ's representative in hell. That's what chaplains did. That's what Morrison would do. He began to read. The ancient words, the liturgy of death and hope. His voice carried through the barn. Other conversations stopped. Men listened, American and German both, hearing the prayer that acknowledged mortality and claimed eternity. O God of grace and glory, we remember before you this day our brother Carl. We thank you for giving him to us, his family and friends, to know and to love as a companion on our earthly pilgrimage. In your boundless compassion, console us who mourn. Give us faith to see in death the gate of eternal life, so that in quiet confidence we may continue our course on earth, until, by your call, we are reunited with those who have gone before. Carl listened with closed eyes. Tears ran down his cheeks. Not from pain, from something else. Relief, maybe? Gratitude. The knowledge that he wouldn't die alone after all, that someone cared enough to pray, even an enemy, even a man who had every reason to refuse. Morrison continued. Read through the entire commendation service, modified slightly for circumstances but maintaining the core meaning, recognition of sin, petition for mercy, commitment of the soul to God's keeping, the framework that Christians had used for centuries to face death with hope instead of despair. When he finished, Morrison closed the book, sat quietly. Carl's breathing had slowed, become shallower. The end was close now. Minutes, maybe less. Thank you, Carl whispered, for seeing me, for praying, for... He couldn't finish, didn't need to. Morrison understood. "Go in peace, Carl," Morrison said, used the liturgical phrase, the blessing he'd given 63 times to dying Americans, now given to dying German. "May God receive you into his mercy." Carl smiled, weak but genuine. "Peace," he repeated. "Yes, that would be good." He died 3 minutes later, quietly, without pain. The morphine had done its job. Morrison sat with him until the end, held his hand, prayed silently, offered presence, if not understanding. When it was over, Morrison closed Carl's eyes, made the sign of the cross, committed the soul to whatever came next. The medics covered the body, tagged it for burial, German cemetery, separate from Americans. That's how it worked. Even in death, enemies stayed separated, different crosses, different ground, different remembrance. Morrison stood. His legs were shaky. His heart was heavy. He'd done what faith demanded, what God required, but it didn't feel like victory, just felt like more death, more grief, more questions without answers. He walked outside, needed air, needed space, needed to process what he'd done. The other soldiers watched him go, said nothing. They didn't know what to say. Morrison didn't know either. The sky was grey. Snow threatened. The war continued in the distance. Artillery rumbled. Machine guns chattered. Men fought and died, the eternal rhythm of combat. Morrison had been in it for 18 months. Sometimes felt like 18 years. Sometimes felt like 18 minutes. Time lost meaning in war. Just became a succession of crises and deaths and prayers that might or might not matter. Morrison pulled out his prayer book. Looked at it. The worn leather cover. The pages marked with blood and mud. The words that were supposed to offer comfort. Supposed to provide answers. Supposed to make sense of senselessness. He'd prayed over 64 soldiers now. 63 Americans, 1 German. The American prayers felt right. Felt necessary, felt like his duty and his calling and his purpose. The German prayer felt complicated, felt challenging, felt like something he'd wrestle with for a long time. Had he done right? He didn't know. Theology said yes. Every soul deserves mercy. That was foundational. That was non-negotiable. But his heart said maybe. Maybe mercy had limits. Maybe some sins were too great. Maybe comfort should be reserved for the innocent, or at least for your own side. Morrison would spend the rest of his life thinking about that afternoon, about Karl Hoffmann, about the prayer he'd offered and the questions it raised, about mercy and justice and the impossible choices war forced on people who were just trying to do right. But in that moment, standing in the snow outside a barn full of dying men, Morrison didn't have answers, just had questions, and faith, and the terrible knowledge that sometimes doing right felt wrong, and sometimes doing wrong felt necessary, and sometimes you just had to choose and live with it and hope God understood even if you didn't. He went back inside. More wounded would arrive, more prayers would be needed, more decisions would have to be made. Morrison would be there, offering what he could, praying as he must, trusting that it mattered even when it felt pointless. That was chaplaincy. That was ministry in war. Not answers, just presence. Not certainty, just faith. Not comfort, just the willingness to sit with the dying and offer what little hope could be offered when hope seemed impossible. Morrison did it for 63 more soldiers before the war ended. Some American, some German, some Belgian civilians caught in crossfire, some who believed, some who didn't, all who needed someone to acknowledge their humanity in the moment of their death. Each prayer changed him, made him question, made him doubt, made him angry at God and war and the entire apparatus that created such suffering. But each prayer also deepened him, made him more compassionate, more willing to see beyond uniforms and nations and sides, more committed to the belief that every soul mattered, that every death deserved witness, that every person, no matter how broken or guilty or wrong, deserved someone to pray for them when the end came. Karl Hoffmann was the first, but not the last. Morrison would pray for enemy soldiers 17 more times before VE Day. Each time was hard. Each time raised questions. Each time forced him to choose between easy answers and difficult truths. The second came 3 days after Karl. Another German, younger, maybe 20, wounded in the legs by artillery, septic, dying of infection. He'd been a prisoner for a week. The medics had tried to save him. Failed. Infection was too advanced. Antibiotics too scarce. The boy was conscious, aware he was dying, terrified. He asked for his mother. Not prayer, not God, just his mother. Kept calling for her in German. Morrison didn't speak German, but he understood anyway. Knew that dying men always called for their mothers in the end. American, German, didn't matter. At the final moment, everyone wanted their mother. Morrison sat with him, held his hand, prayed quietly in English. The German didn't understand the words probably, but he understood the presence, the compassion, the willingness of an enemy to sit with him and acknowledge his suffering. He died more peacefully than he would have alone. The third was a week later. German sergeant, older, 40 maybe, career soldier. He'd been wounded badly. Stomach wound, perforated intestines, gangrene. He was conscious but fading. Knew he had hours at most. He spoke some English, enough to communicate. "I have killed many of your men," he told Morrison. Blunt, honest, no pretense. "I do not ask forgiveness. I only ask that someone remember I existed, that my life mattered, even if I did terrible things." Morrison prayed with him. Long prayer, comprehensive, acknowledged the sergeant's humanity. His sin, his need for mercy, asked God to receive him, not because he deserved it, but because God's grace extended even to those who didn't deserve it. The sergeant listened, nodded, seemed at peace when the end came. Each prayer was different. Each dying man had different needs, different questions, different levels of faith or doubt or fear. Morrison adapted, offered what each man needed, sometimes traditional liturgy, sometimes just presence, sometimes silence broken by occasional words of comfort. The American soldiers watched. Some understood, some didn't. A few complained, questioned why Morrison wasted time on enemies, why he offered comfort to people who'd killed Americans, why he treated German deaths the same as American ones. Morrison tried to explain, about universal human worth, about God's love transcending national boundaries, about how mercy didn't depend on deserving. Some got it, some didn't. Morrison kept praying anyway, doing what he believed God required, even when it cost him, even when it alienated him, even when it made ministry harder. One American soldier confronted him directly, Corporal Jackson, from Tennessee. Good soldier, reliable, but angry. He'd lost friends, watched men die, blamed Germany for all of it. Couldn't understand why Morrison prayed for the enemy. "They killed my buddies," Jackson said, voice tight with rage. "Tommy, Steve, Pete, all dead because of Krauts. And you sit there praying for them like they matter, like they deserve God's mercy." Morrison understood the anger, shared it sometimes, but his faith demanded something different. "They do matter," he said quietly, "and they do deserve mercy. Not because they earned it, because God offers it to everyone, including us, including them." "That's bullshit," Jackson spat. "God's on our side, not theirs. We're the good guys. They're evil. It's that simple." "Is it?" Morrison asked. Not confrontational, just genuine question. Is it really that simple? All Americans good, all Germans evil. No complexity, no nuance, no individual responsibility. Jackson hesitated. Wanted to say yes, but couldn't, because he knew it wasn't that simple. Knew good Americans who did bad things. New Germans who seemed like decent people caught in terrible circumstances. New war made everyone complicit in ways that defied simple categories. "I don't know," Jackson admitted finally, "but I know they killed my friends, and I can't forgive that. Can't pray for that." "I understand," Morrison said. "I can't either sometimes, but I try, because that's what faith asks. Not feelings, not comfort, just obedience, just showing up, just offering mercy even when it feels wrong." Jackson walked away, still angry, still struggling, but thinking. Morrison saw him at other German deathbeds later, watching, not praying, but not leaving either, wrestling with his own feelings about mercy and justice and what it meant to be Christian in a world at war. That was all Morrison could do. Model, witness, offer an example of faith in action even when action was uncomfortable, plant seeds, trust God to water them, trust that someday Jackson and others like him would understand that mercy wasn't weakness, was actually the hardest form of strength. Morrison prayed for Germans who died cursing him, Germans who spat at him, Germans who refused his help until the very end. When fear overwhelmed pride, he prayed for all of them, not because he wanted to, because he had to, because his faith left no other option, because seeing some people as deserving and others as undeserving was exactly the thinking that created wars in the first place. The war went on. More battles, more casualties, more prayers. Morrison counted 64 enemy soldiers he prayed for between Karl Hoffmann and VE Day. Some Wehrmacht, some SS. That was harder. SS had done terrible things. Concentration camps, mass murders, war crimes. Morrison knew this, struggled with praying for men who'd been part of that system. But he did it anyway, because they were still human, still dying, still in need of grace. If Morrison started categorizing who deserved prayer and who didn't, where did it end? Who decided which sins were forgivable and which weren't? Who drew those lines? Morrison refused to draw them, offered prayer to everyone who asked, everyone who needed, everyone who was dying, regardless of what they'd done. God would judge. Morrison's job was just to pray, to witness, to be present. That was chaplaincy at its core, not judgment, just mercy. VE Day came on May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Soldiers celebrated, drank, sang, fired weapons in the air. Relief flooded through the ranks. They'd survived, would go home, would see families, would live. Morrison celebrated with them, felt genuine relief, genuine joy. The killing would stop. No more funerals, no more prayers over dying boys, no more ethical dilemmas about who deserved comfort and who didn't. Just peace. Finally, blessedly, impossibly. But the next morning, Morrison woke up feeling empty, hollowed out. The war was over, but he'd been changed by it, broken by it in some ways, reformed in others. He wasn't the same chaplain who'd landed on Omaha Beach, wasn't the same man who'd graduated from seminary, wasn't sure who he was anymore, except someone who'd seen too much and prayed too often and questioned everything he'd once held certain. He stayed in Europe for months after VE Day, occupation duty, helping rebuild, ministering to soldiers waiting to go home, conducting services, counseling men struggling with what they'd done and seen, processing trauma that wouldn't be called PTSD for decades, but was already destroying lives. Morrison saw it everywhere. Men who couldn't sleep, who jumped at loud noises, who drank too much, who fought unnecessarily, who withdrew from friends, who seemed alive but weren't really, just going through motions, haunted by things they couldn't name and couldn't escape. He tried to help, offered prayer. Counsel, just listening when that's all they needed. Some men responded, some didn't. Some were too broken, too far gone. Morrison did what he could and lived with the inadequacy of his help. He came home in early 1946, discharged, civilian again. The uniform felt strange. Civilian clothes felt stranger. Everything felt wrong, off-kilter, like he didn't belong anywhere anymore. Not in the church, not in the army, not in the world of people who hadn't seen what he'd seen, who couldn't understand what he'd experienced. He returned to Chicago, applied to churches, got interviews. Some went well, some didn't. One board asked about his war service, asked what he'd learned. Morrison mentioned praying for German soldiers. Watching the board's faces change, saw judgment, disapproval, concern that Morrison had gone soft on evil, that he'd lost his moral clarity, that he couldn't be trusted to lead a congregation properly. They didn't hire him, neither did the next church or the one after that. Morrison's wartime reputation preceded him. The chaplain who prayed for Nazis, who saw no difference between American and German deaths, who'd lost his patriotism somewhere in the European mud. Morrison didn't defend himself, didn't explain, just kept applying, kept interviewing, kept trusting that God would open a door somewhere. Some congregation would understand, would value his experience instead of fearing it. That door opened in a working-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, Bethel Presbyterian. Small church, aging building, congregation of maybe 80, mostly factory workers, immigrants, people who understood suffering, who knew hardship, who didn't need platitudes about God's protection because life had already proven that wrong. They hired Morrison, not despite his war service, because of it. They wanted a minister who understood that faith was complicated, that life was hard, that God's grace had to be big enough to cover everyone, or it wasn't really grace at all. Morrison thrived there, preached every Sunday, but not simple sermons, not three-point outlines about positive thinking, real sermons, wrestling with doubt, acknowledging suffering, refusing to pretend faith offered easy answers when life's questions were impossibly hard. He talked about Karl Hoffman, about the ethical dilemma, about praying for enemies, used it as an example of what Christian mercy really meant. Not feelings, not comfort, just obedience to a God who commanded love even for enemies, especially for enemies. The congregation responded, grew, word spread. Other churches wanted Morrison to speak, to share his perspective, to help their congregations understand what war did to faith, what faith required in response to trauma, how to process suffering without losing belief. Morrison became known, not famous, just known in certain circles, the chaplain who'd prayed for Nazis, who'd wrestled with God and come out believing in radical grace, who refused simple answers and offered instead faithful presence in complexity. He married in 1948. Mary, good woman. She'd been a nurse during the war, served in England, understood trauma, understood what soldiers experienced, understood Morrison in ways most people couldn't. They bonded over shared understanding of how war changed people, how you could never fully explain it to someone who wasn't there, how you just had to live with the changes and build something new from the pieces that remained. They had 3 children. Morrison tried to be a good father, tried to pass on faith without traumatizing them, tried to teach them about grace and mercy, and the importance of seeing everyone as human. Mostly succeeded. His children grew up compassionate, questioning, committed to justice but also to forgiveness, understanding that both mattered and neither was easy. He told them about the war eventually, when they were old enough, showed them his chaplain's cross, told them about the prayers, about Karl Hoffman, about the 63 other enemy soldiers he'd prayed for, used it to teach them about courage, about doing what's right even when it's hard, about how faith requires action and action requires sacrifice. His oldest son asked, was it worth it? All that struggle, all those hard choices. Morrison thought about that. 30 years later, still thinking about it. I don't know if it was worth it, he said honestly, but it was necessary. God asked me to do it. I obeyed. That has to be worth something, even if I don't understand what. That became his standard answer to anyone who asked. Not certainty, not easy resolution, Just honest acknowledgement that faith was hard and choices were complicated, and you did your best and trusted God with the results. He chose truth every time, even when it hurt, even when it felt wrong, even when other soldiers questioned him, even when he questioned himself. He chose to pray, to offer mercy, to see the human behind the uniform, to trust that God's grace was big enough to cover even the sins of enemies. That was Morrison's war. Not battles or strategy or tactics, just one dying man after another, just prayer after prayer, just faith stretched to its absolute limit, and somehow holding, somehow surviving, somehow still believing that mercy mattered even in hell, especially in hell. Because if mercy didn't matter there, where did it matter? If grace couldn't reach the worst people in the worst circumstances, what good was it? If God's love had limits, then it wasn't really love, just preference, just tribalism in religious clothing. Morrison refused that, chose instead the harder path, the path that said everyone deserved mercy, everyone deserved prayer, everyone deserved someone to sit with them in their dying moments and acknowledge that their life had mattered, that their death would be mourned, that God saw them even if others didn't. That was the gospel as Morrison understood it. Not comfort for the comfortable, grace for the deserving, mercy for the righteous, but comfort for the afflicted, grace for the undeserving, mercy for the broken and guilty and lost. That was Jesus. That was Christianity. That was what Morrison had signed up for when he became a chaplain. He just hadn't known how hard it would be, how much it would cost, how many nights he'd lie awake questioning everything, how many times he'd want to quit, how many prayers he'd say while crying, how many dying men he'd sit with, while his own soul screamed at the injustice of it all. But he did it anyway, because that was faith, not certainty, not ease, not answers, just showing up, just doing the work, just offering what you could when you couldn't offer much, just being present when presence was all you had. Morrison survived the war, came home in 1946, returned to Chicago, took a church in a working-class neighborhood, preached every Sunday, performed weddings and baptisms and funerals, counseled couples, visited hospitals, did all the normal things ministers do, but he was different now. Changed by what he'd seen, what he'd done, the prayers he'd offered, the deaths he'd witnessed. War did that, took young men and aged them, took certainty and replaced it with questions, took simple faith and complicated it beyond recognition. Morrison's sermons reflected that. He didn't offer easy answers anymore, didn't pretend faith was simple, didn't shy away from hard questions. He talked about doubt, about struggle, about the times when God seemed absent, about praying for enemies, about offering mercy to the undeserving, about sitting with dying men who'd done terrible things and still choosing compassion. Some people didn't like it, left his church, found ministers who offered certainty. Morrison didn't judge them, understood the appeal of simple answers, but he couldn't offer them anymore. Not after Karl Hoffman, not after 17 more enemy prayers, not after seeing what war did to faith. He married in 1948. Mary, good woman, patient, understanding. She knew he'd been changed by the war, knew something had happened that he couldn't fully explain. She gave him space to process, to heal, to find his way back to a faith that made sense after hell. They had 3 children. Morrison tried to be a good father, tried to teach them about compassion and mercy, and seeing the humanity in everyone, tried to pass on what he'd learned without traumatizing them, mostly succeeded. His children grew up kind, grew up questioning, grew up believing that faith required action, and action required courage, and courage sometimes meant doing things that felt wrong but were right. Morrison told them about Karl Hoffman eventually, when they were old enough to understand, told them about the prayer he'd offered, the struggle he'd faced, the choice he'd made, used it as a teaching moment, as an example of what it meant to live your faith instead of just preaching it. His oldest son asked the obvious question, was it right, praying for the enemy? Morrison thought about that. 30 years after the fact, still thinking about it, still wrestling with it. I don't know if it was right, he said finally, but it was faithful. It was what God asked of me. Whether that makes it right, you'll have to decide for yourself. That became his standard answer to students, to other ministers, to anyone who asked about his war service. Not certainty, not easy answers, just honesty, just acknowledgement that faith was complicated and moral choices were hard, and sometimes you had to choose between competing goods and live with the consequences. Morrison retired in 1982, 67 years old, 40 years of ministry, thousands of sermons, hundreds of funerals, countless prayers. He'd done his best, tried to live what he believed, tried to offer grace to everyone, tried to be the kind of minister Jesus would have wanted. The retirement years were strange. Empty in some ways, liberating in others. No more Sunday sermons, no more committee meetings, no more counseling sessions, just time, lots of time. Time to think, to remember, to process what had happened in those war years and the decades that followed. Karl Hoffman stayed with him. Always. 40 years later, Morrison still thought about that afternoon. The barn, the dying German, the prayer he'd offered, the questions it raised, the way it changed him, made him think differently about enemies, about mercy, about what it meant to be Christian in a world that demanded you choose sides. Morrison wrote about it in his retirement. Not a book, just essays, reflections, attempts to process what he'd learned, what it cost, what it meant. He shared them with other chaplains, other ministers, anyone who might benefit from his experience. One essay was titled, "The Enemy's Death." He wrote about Karl, about the ethical dilemma, about making the choice to pray, about living with the consequences. He was honest, didn't sanitize it, didn't pretend it was easy or that he'd figured it all out, just described what happened and how he'd struggled and why he'd chosen what he chose. The essay circulated, got published in a chaplain's journal, then in a theological magazine, then in an anthology about war and faith. Morrison got letters, dozens of them, from other chaplains, from ministers, from veterans, from people who'd faced similar choices and didn't know if they'd done right. Most letters thanked him, said his honesty helped, said knowing someone else had struggled made their own struggles feel less lonely, said his choice to pray for enemies gave them permission to show mercy when mercy felt wrong. Morrison hadn't expected that, hadn't written for influence, just for processing, for trying to understand his own experience. But the letters kept coming, kept thanking him, kept saying his story mattered. One letter came from Germany, from a woman named Anna Hoffman. She'd read the essay in translation, recognized her husband's name, Karl, lieutenant, died in February 1945 in American custody. She'd never known the circumstances, never known someone had prayed for him, never known he hadn't died completely alone. The letter was brief. Simple, just thank you. Thank you for seeing him as human. Thank you for offering comfort when you didn't have to. Thank you for treating his death as something that mattered instead of just another enemy casualty. Thank you for the mercy she couldn't have asked for because she didn't know to ask. Morrison wept when he read it. First time in years. Wept for Karl, for Anna, for the children who'd grown up without a father, for all the suffering war created, for the mercy that somehow reached across decades and offered comfort he hadn't known was needed. He wrote back, told Anna about those final moments, about Karl's faith, his regret, his hope for peace, his final words. Morrison didn't know if sharing those details would help or hurt, but Anna deserved to know, deserved to understand that her husband hadn't died in hatred, had died seeking God, had found someone willing to help him despite everything. Anna's response came months later. She thanked him again, said knowing the details helped, said she'd wondered for 40 years, imagined terrible scenarios, feared Carl had suffered, been mistreated, died alone and afraid. Morrison's letter gave her peace, gave her closure, gave her the gift of knowing her husband's last moments had contained grace. They corresponded for several years, not frequently, just occasionally, brief letters sharing life updates. Anna's children, Morrison's grandchildren, the ordinary stuff of life that connected them across former enemy lines, across decades of history, across the chasm that war had created, and mercy was slowly healing. Morrison visited Germany in 1987, went to Munich, met Anna in person. She was elderly now, frail, but sharp, kind, still carrying the grief of widowhood, but carrying it with dignity, with faith, with the strength that comes from surviving unimaginable loss. They sat in her living room, looked at photographs. Carl in uniform, young, smiling. Before the war hardened him, broke him, killed him. Anna talked about their life together, the teaching, the students he'd loved, the mathematics he'd found beautiful, the man who'd been husband and father before he became soldier and casualty. He was good man, Anna said in careful English. Not perfect, but good. He did not want war, did not choose it, but he went, and he died. And I raised our children alone. That is what war does. Takes good men, makes them soldiers, kills them, leaves families broken. Morrison nodded, had no words adequate to respond, just sat with her, shared silence, shared grief, shared the weight of what had happened and couldn't be undone. Thank you for praying, Anna said finally. Thank you for seeing him, for treating him as human. Not all chaplains would, not all men would, but you did. That matters. That will always matter. Morrison had no words, just took her hand, squeezed, tried to communicate what he couldn't say, that he was sorry, sorry for Carl's death, sorry for her loss, sorry for all the suffering war created, sorry he couldn't have done more, sorry that prayer was all he'd had to offer. But maybe prayer was enough. Maybe mercy mattered even when it couldn't prevent death. Maybe grace reached beyond the immediate to touch things Morrison couldn't see or understand. Maybe Carl's death had meaning because someone had witnessed it. Someone had cared. Someone had prayed. Morrison returned to Chicago different, changed by the visit, by meeting Anna, by seeing the human consequences of that war beyond just the battlefield, beyond just the dying soldiers, into the families left behind, the wives who became widows, the children who grew up fatherless, the mothers who buried sons, the ripple effects that extended for generations. He wrote more after that. More essays, more reflections. Trying to capture what he'd learned about mercy, about the cost of war, about the importance of seeing enemies as human, about the courage it takes to offer grace when revenge seems more just, about the faith required to believe that compassion matters even when it seems insufficient against the scale of suffering. His final essay was published in 1994, 1 year before he died. It was titled, He Prayed for Everyone. Not about himself, about what chaplaincy required, what ministry demanded, what faith looked like in practice instead of theory. He used Carl as the primary example, but included others, the 63 Americans, the 17 other Germans, all the dying men he'd prayed for across 2 years of war. Ministry is not about answers, he wrote. It's about presence, about showing up when showing up is hard, about offering what you can when you can't offer much, about being willing to sit with the dying and acknowledge their humanity even when everything else says to walk away. That's chaplaincy. That's faith. That's what Jesus asked when he commanded us to love our enemies. Not feelings, not agreement, just willingness to see them, to pray for them, to offer mercy when mercy seems wrong. The essay was Morrison's final theological statement. His last attempt to explain what he'd learned, what had cost him, what he believed mattered most. It was read at his funeral, used as a summary of his life and ministry, offered as a challenge to everyone listening, to be the kind of Christians Morrison had modeled, the kind who prayed for everyone, who offered mercy without boundaries, who refused to let war or hatred or anger determine who deserved compassion. Morrison died in 1995, 78 years old. Heart failure, quick, relatively painless. Mary was with him. His children were with him. He died surrounded by love, by family, by people who knew him and valued him, and would carry his legacy forward. The funeral was large. His congregation came, old parishioners from decades of ministry, other chaplains, ministers he'd mentored, veterans he'd counseled, people whose lives he'd touched in ways he probably never fully knew. They filled the church, overflowed into the fellowship hall, stood outside listening through speakers, all there to honor a man who'd prayed for everyone. His son David gave the eulogy, shared the story of Karl Hoffman, told it again to a new generation, explained the ethical dilemma, the prayer, the choice, used it to explain who Morrison was, what he believed, why he mattered. My father could have refused, David said, could have walked away, could have said that prayer was for Americans only, that mercy had limits, that some people didn't deserve God's comfort. No one would have blamed him. It was war, the rules were different, but he didn't refuse. He prayed for Karl, for 17 other German soldiers, for everyone who needed it, because that's what faith demanded. That's what love required. That's who he was. The congregation listened. Some cried, some nodded, some struggled with the complexity of it, understanding that ministry wasn't easy, that moral choices were hard, that living your faith sometimes meant doing things that felt wrong but were right, that mercy extended further than human preference could accommodate. They buried Morrison in a cemetery outside Chicago, next to Mary, who'd died 2 years earlier, under a simple stone. His name, his dates, his calling, minister, chaplain, servant of God, and one phrase, chosen by his children, inscribed at the bottom, 4 words that captured everything he'd tried to be, everything he'd struggled with, everything he'd ultimately accomplished. He prayed for everyone, simple, true, complete. Morrison's whole ministry in 4 words, his whole war in 4 words, his whole life in 4 words. Not qualification, not caveat, not explanation, just statement of fact. He prayed for everyone, American and German, friend and enemy, righteous and sinner, deserving and undeserving, everyone, because that's what grace meant. Not selective mercy, universal mercy, not love for the lovable, love for everyone, not forgiveness for friends, forgiveness for enemies, not prayer for the righteous, prayer for everyone who needed it, everyone who asked, everyone who was dying and scared and alone. That was the gospel, as Morrison understood it. That was Christianity as he practiced it. That was faith as he lived it. Complicated, costly, uncomfortable, but true, deeply true, true in ways that simple answers could never be. Years passed. Morrison's children grew old. His grandchildren had children. His story was told and retold, passed down through generations, changed slightly with each telling but maintaining the core. One chaplain, one dying German, one prayer, one choice that defined a lifetime. The story reached people Morrison never met, never knew, never imagined would care. It appeared in seminary classes, in ethics courses, in discussions about war and faith and the limits of mercy. It challenged people, made them uncomfortable, made them question what they believed about enemies and grace and whether love really meant everyone or just people like us. Some rejected it, said Morrison was wrong, said mercy had limits, said enemies didn't deserve prayer, said giving comfort to evil was itself evil, said Morrison had been corrupted by liberal theology. had lost his moral center, had betrayed his country and his fellow soldiers by treating German deaths as equivalent to American deaths. Morrison would have understood that reaction, would have expected it even. But he would have disagreed, gently, patiently, with the same conviction that drove him to pray for Karl, despite every reason not to, because faith wasn't about comfort, wasn't about agreeing with cultural norms, was about obedience to God even when God asked hard things, especially when God asked hard things. Others embraced it, found in Morrison's story permission to show mercy they'd been afraid to show, found example of faithful obedience, when obedience seemed impossible, found hope that grace really was big enough to cover everyone, that love really could extend to enemies, that prayer really mattered even in hell, especially in hell. Those were the people Morrison had ministered to without knowing it, the ones who heard his story decades after his death, and found it spoke to their own struggles, their own questions, their own attempts to live faithfully in a world that demanded compromise. Morrison's example gave them courage, gave them a model, gave them proof that choosing mercy wasn't weakness but strength. That was legacy, not fame, not recognition, just influence that rippled forward through time, touching lives Morrison never knew, changing hearts he never saw, offering hope he never delivered personally, but delivered nonetheless through the story of one prayer offered to one dying enemy in one barn in the Ardennes. Karl Hoffmann had been dead for 70 years when Morrison's story reached its widest audience. A documentary filmmaker discovered it, made a film, interviewed Morrison's children, visited the barn in Belgium where it happened, talked to historians about the Ardennes campaign, about chaplaincy, about the ethical dilemmas soldiers faced, about mercy in warfare. The film was called Grace in the Dying Light, focused on Morrison's choice to pray for Karl, used it as a lens to examine bigger questions about war and morality and faith, about how we determine who deserves compassion, about whether enemies can ever really be seen as human, about what it costs to choose mercy when revenge seems more just. The film aired in 2015, 70 years after Karl's death, 20 years after Morrison's death, 50 years after the war ended. It reached millions, won awards, started conversations, made people think about mercy differently, made them question what they believed about enemies and grace, and whether love really meant everyone or just some people. Morrison's children watched it, saw their father's story told to a global audience, saw Karl Hoffmann humanized, saw Anna's letters included, saw the barn where it happened, saw other chaplains reflecting on similar choices they'd faced, saw the impact Morrison's decision had made on theology and ethics, and the ongoing conversation about war and faith. They were proud, not because Morrison was famous. He wasn't, just because his story mattered, because his choice had consequences beyond that one moment, because his willingness to pray when prayer seemed wrong had given other people permission to show mercy when mercy seemed impossible. That's what Morrison would have wanted. Not fame, just faithfulness. Not recognition, just impact. Not personal glory, just the knowledge that his choice mattered, that Karl's death wasn't meaningless, that the prayer he'd offered in that barn had echoed forward through decades and touched lives and changed hearts and made the world slightly more merciful than it would have been otherwise. His voice brought them grace. 4 men died in his arms over 2 years of war, and countless more found comfort through his ministry. 64 enemy soldiers received prayers when prayers should have been denied. Thousands of American soldiers found hope when hope seemed lost. Millions more would eventually hear the story and wrestle with its implications, all because one chaplain chose to pray when prayer was the hardest thing he could do. He prayed for everyone. 4 words on a gravestone. 4 words that told a life story. 4 words that captured everything Morrison believed and practiced and died knowing he'd done right. Not perfectly, not easily, not without doubt or struggle or cost, but right, faithful, true to a God who commanded love even for enemies, especially for enemies. That was Morrison's war. That was his legacy. That was why his story mattered 70 years later and would matter 70 years more. Not because he was special, but because he was faithful. Not because he had answers, but because he asked the right questions. Not because his choice was easy, but because he made it anyway. Grace in the dying light. Mercy in hell. Prayer for enemies. Love when love seemed wrong. That was faith. That was Christianity. That was what Jesus asked. And Morrison delivered, and 70 years of Christians after him tried to emulate. The war ended. The soldiers went home. The crosses were planted. The graves were dug. The prayers were said. But some things echoed. Some stories mattered. Some choices changed everything. Morrison's prayer for Carl was one of those, a moment that transcended itself, became more than one chaplain and one dying German, became a symbol, an example, a challenge, a question that every generation had to answer. Will you pray for your enemies? Will you offer mercy to the undeserving? Will you see the humanity in people who've done terrible things? Will you choose grace when revenge seems more just? Will you be faithful when faithfulness costs you? Will you love everyone or just the people like you? Morrison answered yes. Against every reason to say no. Against the grief and the anger and the 63 American graves he dug that day. Against the understandable human response to categorize and judge and withhold compassion from those who didn't deserve it. Against all of that, Morrison said yes. He prayed for Carl, for 17 others, for everyone who needed it. And in that yes, in that prayer, in that choice, he became what chaplains were meant to be. Not defenders of one side, not judges of worthiness, not gatekeepers of grace, but witnesses, prayer givers, people willing to sit with the dying and offer the only comfort that really mattered in the end. The comfort that someone saw you, someone cared, someone believed your life and death mattered, and God was waiting. That's gospel. That's mercy. That's grace. That's what Morrison offered in a barn in the Ardennes to a dying German lieutenant who should have been his enemy, but became his brother. In that final moment when all that mattered was two humans facing eternity together with prayer as the only bridge between them. He prayed for everyone. The rest was just history. Carl Hoffman had been dead for 50 years when Morrison died. His grave was somewhere in Belgium, marked or unmarked, known or forgotten. Morrison never found it, never tried, didn't need to. Carl lived in Morrison's memory, in his heart, in the questions that shaped his ministry. One dying man, one prayer, one choice, changed everything. Made Morrison question, made him grow, made him understand that mercy wasn't about deserving, grace wasn't about earning, faith wasn't about comfort, just about showing up, being present, offering what you could when you couldn't offer much. That was the lesson of Carl Hoffman. The legacy of that afternoon in a barn in the Ardennes, not answers, just deeper questions, not certainty, just deeper faith, not simplicity, just deeper faith, not simplicity, just deeper understanding that God's mercy was bigger than human judgment, that grace extended further than human comfort, that love required risks human preference couldn't accommodate. Morrison took those risks, offered that grace, extended that mercy for 50 years to everyone. American and German, righteous and sinner, deserving and undeserving. He prayed for them all, and in doing so he became what chaplains are meant to be, not defenders of one side, not judges of worthiness, not gatekeepers of grace, just witnesses, just prayer givers, just people willing to sit with the dying and offer the only comfort that really matters in the end. The comfort that someone sees you, someone cares, someone believes your life mattered and your death matters, and God is waiting to receive you, not because you earned it, but because He loves you. That's gospel. That's mercy. That's what Morrison offered to 64 dying soldiers, 63 Americans, one German, all equal in death, all worthy of prayer, All children of God, regardless of uniform or nation or sin. That was Morrison's war. That was his faith. That was his legacy. He prayed for everyone. The rest was just details.